Alrighty then. So, before we get started, have to go over the quiz. I'm guessing those of you in this room did pretty well, because you guys actually come to class and all that kind of stuff. And if you don't, you probably pay attention to the online lectures. But that's not exactly the case for everyone else. The average for those who participated was 55.6%, a solid F. And we had about 23% of the class who didn't even participate. So that makes the average go down to 42.5%. Those are some abysmal grades, and it really shows that those who are not paying attention ought to be, because these questions were pretty much derived directly from what I emphasized in class multiple times, or from the readings. And in fact, just as I've been trying to hit on every single lecture, the previous lecture only has 17 views. Judging from the number of people who attended that lecture, it should be over 40. So, clearly, people are not participating, people are not going and watching the lectures if they haven't been. This is vitally important to getting a good grade. You know, you can technically not attend class at all, though you won't be able to do you won't be able to participate in class discussions, but if you feel confident that you don't need to, that's up to you. But it's not an option to just blow off the lectures altogether. So, wanted to go over the actual questions and answers real quick, because it was so bad I might as well say what the correct answers were. So, the first question was, what kind of culture lived on the Great Plains prior to 1492? Now, a lot of people answered horse nomads. And can you go close that door? That one's going to catch up on the sound. No, keep that one open so that we can keep some breeze in here. It seems like this building doesn't even have air conditioning. But that one shouldn't be picked up on this mic. So, a lot of people answered that question with horse riding nomads. Part of the problem is prior to 1492, or prior to European contact, there were no horses. So that's a pretty much impossible answer, and literally put in there to trip people up who weren't paying attention. So the correct answer was river villagers. You know, the Rikara, Mandan, folks like that. The next one was, what impact did the Ottoman Empire have on Columbus's voyages? I am surprised by the number of people who thought that the Ottoman Empire had taken over Spain. They had not. But it is because they threatened the Spanish access to the Silk Road. That's why everybody was looking for a way west, rather than trying to go east, which was now being threatened by the Ottomans. Basically, the entire reason why Columbus sailed was because of what happened in 1453 in Constantinople. Next, what was the purpose of Rangers in colonial America? Guerrilla warfare. They were taking on the type of warfare that they were trying to hunt down. Indian warfare. So, obviously, they wouldn't be trying to be police. They wouldn't be trying to be heavy infantry if they're trying to take on the tactics of those that they were hunting. What did the Shining City on a Hill represent? That was exemplary Christian values. Now, people nowadays we'll use that term for numerous things, especially relating to American exceptionalism, but originally it stood for how the Puritans would be a shining city on a hill, exemplary of what Christian values can do. That the eye of God and the world was staring upon the colony of Massachusetts Bay to see whether or not Puritans could really be pure. Now, it's morphed over the years, but that's, if you had read the assigned reading, that would be the answer. Although, I think a few people got the joke on the electric light bulb one and just chose it for fun. And finally, what was the main purpose of the witch trials in colonial America? Now, basically, all of those are not wrong, that they weren't purposes, but they weren't the main purpose. The thing that I emphasized in the lecture was that it was to remove undesirables from society. So, those were the answers. Hopefully, next time, those who are having trouble, there will be many more tests to make up that grade. It's a minor portion of your grade, so failing one isn't that big of a deal. But it also illustrates that those who did poorly should be paying more attention. So, today we're talking about the Great Awakening. Remember, last lecture we were talking about the general crisis, where basically more power was centered in the colonies. They became somewhat independent, but still very much part of the empire through things like the triangle trade and all that kind of stuff, where there was this transformation of power from feudalism to mercantilism, right? So, with that change in power came a lot more secularization. In fact, secularization is basically what started the ball rolling on that change in power. But, as you might guess, colonies that were founded on keeping Christianity pure don't exactly like it when merchants start making good money and are more based around greed and things that they find to be morally abhorrent. And so there would be a series of revivals in the early 18th century in reaction to all of this stuff that we talked in the previous lecture. Because they saw everything as moral slippage, that there'd been this steady fall from grace. And when they say grace, they mean the grace of God, not just some random, good standing. Grace is a very specific concept in Christianity, basically meaning that you are ordained to go to heaven. And according to Puritans, you didn't really have a choice in the matter. It wasn't about what you did in life, but what you did in life could indicate whether or not you had been saved. So, this moral slippage wasn't just something seen as, we're not doing as well in terms of our ethics or anything. This was that people were becoming more and more doomed to hell. And so, of course, they're going to react to that. Especially because of the real nastiness that we talked about with the triangle trade. With that middle passage, the end of that middle passage is the New World. And people are seeing all these slaves coming off of these boats, degraded and demoralized, that they're coming off of these boats they're disease-ridden. They have to take weeks before they can even be sold because they have to recuperate from the voyage. And then once they're sold off, they're slaves. They're treated as property. And there's also a racial element to the concern because, they're very different looking, obviously. They're black. Now, at this point, their concept of race isn't as fully developed as ours is. There isn't really this idea of black and white, but it's because of this triangle trade that they start seeing black and white, that there's a significant difference, and you start seeing slave codes in the late 17th and early 18th century, where it's very much based on race, where people are disenfranchised, for instance, even if they're free and a person of color, that they are disenfranchised from becoming part of the House of Burgesses in Virginia, and things along those lines. And those are developments that show that there's an increasing realization that people have this idea of differences in race. It's not fully developed, and in fact, we're, as a culture nowadays, really working hard to deconstruct a lot of this. But this is the process by which race is constructed. And it's very much based on this triangle trade. Now, remember from last time that the triangle trade is based specifically that you have slaves coming from Africa, raw goods or rum coming from the New World, and then manufactured goods coming from the Old World, from Europe. And that's what makes that triangle, connecting all three continents. Well, 4 continents if you're including South America. And as a result, it's this feedback mechanism of wealth that a lot of New England traders become really wealthy. And this is especially a thing that the Puritans start to see because a lot of timber is coming from New England. New England timber operations became one of the main ways in which raw material was produced in New England, but a lot of that raw material went specifically to bolstering this this triangle trade, and can you guess how? Anybody? Shipbuilding. Yes. A lot of this timber is going straight from the hinterlands to the dry docks to build new ships to bolster this entire triangle trade. Some of the best wood produced in the period was from New England. In fact, by the time that the U.S. Navy was being created, the first 6 frigates had special double layers of this kind of wood that gave them the name Old Ironsides. They were thought to be so thick that they acted like iron because the wood was that good. And so you have all of this dynamic. This also means that people start figuring out new ways of making ships. First you have you see the rapid development of ship and sail tech, from the sloop to the schooner to the brigantine to the brig, all of which become bigger, faster, and able to carry more. And that's a big deal when you're talking about trying to maximize this trade. And because of mercantilism, you also have a lot of smuggling going on. And so people need faster ships to be able to outrun the Royal Navy. Also, remember that the Enlightenment starts because of the great, the general crisis. You had folks like Thomas Hobbes writing the Leviathan in 1651. Isaac Newton published his Principia Mathematica, which is kind of what we call Newtonian physics today, which gave us the entire way that we would calculate how the universe functioned, all the way until Einstein, basically. Obviously, there's various incremental changes, but you see, by 1687, that the universe is being described scientifically, which is yet again pulling away from religion, right? Suddenly, the Earth is not the center of the universe. Suddenly, the inner workings of things like gravity and that can be explained mathematically rather than by God. But of course, there's ways of dealing with that religiously, just not if you're a Puritan. Also, John Locke in 1689 wrote his 2 treatises on government, and Voltaire became active in the early 18th century as well. So you have all this kind of cosmopolitan exchange of ideas that's increasingly secular, and increasingly kind of radical. You have these ideas from folks like John Locke who are saying that property is innately a right and that it is not something that like a king can give, but solely something related to improvement of the land. And then you have Thomas Hobbes, who was very much a monarchist, but instead of it being the divine right of kings, he's saying that it's a social contract, that everyone comes together, and whether or not you're actually signing a contract, the idea is that by being a member of a society, you are necessarily giving a little bit of power to the king in order to stave off what he called the war of all men, aka, in a state of nature, everyone's fighting each other, is what he thought. But you can see the Enlightenment is very much more and more secular. And of course, another thing is that more people are starting to realize that these fundamentally religious colonies need to allow for other religions to exist with them, especially folks like the Rhode Island settlement became a haven for Baptists, and same with the Quakers were ruling Pennsylvania, but were very much religiously tolerant. And in fact, you get a batch of Baptists there who would steadily not want to engage in all this fighting that we'll see in the next lecture. And they kind of split off to form what we now call the Amish. And these kinds of religious communities form their own groups rather than letting the colony dictate what religion will be. There's especially a growth in what's called congregationalism, where instead of each congregation being tied directly to the colony or some major religious figure throughout the colony or anything along those lines, each congregation is kind of its own particular theology. And you can see how even allowing a little bit of religious freedom is still kind of secularization, because no longer can you dictate religion. Now you have to act as if differences in religion are okay. Because, let's see here. There was also the fact that after 1709, the witch trials convictions were reversed, making people realize that there's fundamental problems with this kind of puritanical court system that exists throughout New England. So all of that, there's also this idea of praying Indians. Now, you might remember from last week, King Philip's War, because Metacom, King Philip, was actually a praying Indian that he had converted to Christianity. The idea of a praying Indian is merely that they come to a mission and convert. In Spanish, we would call them, in Spanish lands, we would call them neophytes. But that's kind of a Catholic-only term. For Protestants, they're called praying Indians. And these praying Indians necessarily threaten the status quo as well, because now you have an influx of a different race. And remember, the concept of race is being constructed at this time. This whole idea of white identity is fairly new. And so in 1646, the Act for the Propagation of the Gospel amongst Indians was passed by Massachusetts Colony, and many other colonies followed suit, basically, in 1650, that became an act of Parliament. So you have this impetus to convert Indians, but at the same time, this new idea of white supremacy is being threatened. And so people who want to keep these what they would consider heathens, even though they're actually Christians, separate, further secularizes. You can see more and more secularism threatens Puritan control, threatens any religion's control. Remember, the southern colonies aren't exactly Puritan, but for instance, Maryland is openly Catholic, Pennsylvania is openly Quaker. They're all very much Christian, and this is all seen as leaving the grace of God. We already talked about Congregationalism. Nice. Though, speaking of Congregationalism, the founding of Yale and Harvard were specifically Congregationalist, so that as well makes for more and more secularization. You get the whole idea here. And so, quickly, people want to revive Christianity. The whole idea of revivals is bringing people back into the fold who have become not Christian enough. When you see some of those evangelical preachers on TV, they're not just campaigning. I mean, a lot of the time they're really just campaigning for money, but what they're ultimately trying to do is convert people, to bring them, to make them more Christian, to bring them into the fold and have more people saved by the grace of God. With this, this kind of wanting to make people more Christian is called evangelism. It's a combination of Lutheran pietism, where basically it's about how well you understand the Bible and its teachings. Anglican Puritanism, of course, that's basically what New England is. And Presbyterianism, which in the New World was basically the Church of England. Now remember that Puritans are technically Anglicans, but they find the Anglican Church to not be pure enough. Presbyterians are Congregationalists who stick closer to the Anglican Church. All of those things combined to emphasize a commitment to God, not only through piety and faith, but through feeling, that people were feeling that they were close to God. This whole idea of grace, right? Now, there's a number of ways that these folks thought that they could find grace. You know, that, for instance, this guy in early 20th century Germany considered the foundation of capitalism to be specifically this search for grace. This idea of what he called the spirit of capitalism, which was basically you knew if you had been graced by God, by if you had been successful in commercial ventures, by work. But a lot of these folks would take issue with that interpretation because works and grace are supposed to be completely separate things according to Puritans. But you can see there's a lot of different interpretations here. The main point is trying to find grace, trying to know whether or not you had been saved. In fact, this week you will be reading a sermon that's called Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. That basically says, no matter what, you're doomed to hell. But you can know if you're doomed to hell by whether or not you're properly Christian. So faith begets grace, but grace does not beget faith. So, what was my place in these notes? Yes, Methodism. So, in the late 1720s, a group of people in England started seeing this kind of moral slippage as something that they needed to work out. It was basically another puritanical movement in England, right? And in 1729, they officially founded the Holy Club, which believed in the fulfilling belief in vigorous missionary work, and that they believed in the what's called the total depravity of humanity. Basically, because Eve ate the apple, we're all sinners, no matter what, even when you're born. That original sin is not just something that was commuted by Christ, but something that was that's literally born into everyone, and you have to find grace by seeking God, by being more Christian. They also believed in this idea of double predestination, which is basically what we've been talking about, that you're doomed to hell or heaven before birth, that God literally chooses whether or not you will go to hell or heaven, but you can find out if you're going to hell or heaven, or just roughly hope that that you're going because you're closer to Christ. And remember, most of these folks are Trinitarians, so they find Christ and God to be the same person. And in the 1730s, this guy named George Whitefield and John Wesley and the Wesley brothers traveled to the colonies specifically to spread the gospel. They have this idea that they're coming to save people from depravity, right? Although there does seem to be a bit of an irony there, right? That if you think that that people are doomed to hell or heaven from birth, then what's the point of converting them? I mean, they're doomed anyways, right? But don't need to get into how these beliefs start to contradict each other. They didn't see it as a contradiction. So, beginning in the 1710s and 20s, there were sporadic revivals amongst congregations where people would basically, a new preacher would be appointed to a congregation, and they'd start speaking fire and brimstone and saying, if you're not coming to church on Sunday, then you're doomed to hell, and that kind of thing. Although, remember, there's a point to all this that you can see kind of a more pragmatic edge to all this, because if you're trying to get people to come to church more often, as a preacher, you're getting more and more donations, right? You're getting more tithings. So keep that in mind when we're talking about all this. There could be that background motivation. So, and then once the Wesley brothers and George Whitefield arrive, then you really see this burst of evangelism throughout the colonies, especially starting in New England. So in 1734, Jonathan Edwards starts preaching that sermon that you will be reading, which really brings out the fire and brimstone. It's sinners in the hands of an angry God, and it talks about being dangled over the pit and whatnot. And when you're going around trying to bring people back into the fold, that's a pretty effective way of doing it, right? Like you're doming yourself to the pit. But when George Whitefield, who had gone back to England for a little bit, he returned in 1739 and started trying to kind of reel a little bit of this back, though still very conspicuously working with folks like Edwards. And in 1740, Gilbert Tennent starts touring New England, and this guy really, instead of it being individual revivals in each congregation, he's going congregation to congregation to congregation as a touring preacher. Instead of like what is pictured here, where it's just, this guy comes to town and, a small gathering is done. This guy becomes a sensation, right? He's going for a year-long tour around the entirety of the colonies, trying to bring people back into the fold and all that kind of stuff. But he's also doing it as a tour, as some sort of celebrity thing. So of course he's getting a bunch of news coverage, and people are printing out pamphlets about it and all that kind of stuff. And so this really gets the ball rolling. And in 1741, and you can see 39, 40, 41, these are really close together. Everybody's working off of each other, right? And this whole movement is building up. And in 1741, this guy named James Davenport began, who's generally thought of as the craziest of the batch. He was a fire and brimstone preacher of the worst sort, the kind of person that you expect to see out in the quad, spitting victuals at people and saying that, we're all sinners for being in a university. That's the level of crazy it got to. And yet, because folks before him had been building up this entire movement, it continued, and he wasn't denounced. Let's see. In fact, in 1743, he held public book burnings throughout the colonies. As he's touring, he held public book burnings. So that's the level of craziness we're getting to, right? When it's like all these Enlightenment philosophers, John Locke and Thomas Hobbes, Newton, all of those sorts, they have led us astray from the path of God, and therefore those books need to be burned. See, gets to the craziness that it gets to. And so by 1745, things start to die down, people start to kind of realize this is going a little too far. I like being able to calculate the trajectory of a cannonball or whatever. I like the idea of, representative government. I like the idea of, the Enlightenment. And so quickly people start to push back. And so by 1747, you're not really seeing any more of these revivals. But as you can see, this is like a 3-decade-long period in which people start off with these little tiny revivals where it's mostly just local preachers saying, like, hey, come back, I want you to come to church on Sunday, to, people literally burning books in the streets. And so there's obviously a backlash to this. And this backlash is called the Old Lights, the people who are theologians who don't believe in all this new craziness. The New Light preachers are the revivalists. This guy named Charles Chauncey was the president of Harvard during much of this, and is generally considered to be the leader of the Old Lights. He kind of argued that there needed to be more religious freedom, that there needed to be less of this persecutory complex of saying that, like, if you don't believe this, you're going to hell. And he was the leader of Harvard, so liberalism kind of goes with the territory, does it not? But he also believed in free will, and which, instead of double predestination, in that he believed God had given a free will to man to make our own mistakes, right? He also was an early, what was called Arian. It's not the racial term. Arianism is actually referring to a 2nd century Christian, or 3rd century Christian, named Arius. And Arianism is what we would now call Unitarianism, basically believing that there isn't a trinity, there is only one God. Christ has some sort of different relation with God. He's either the Son of God or something along those lines. Or he's God incarnate, not the whole Holy Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Ghost being separate but somehow equal beings. And this is a radical idea at the time. People back in England who are Unitarians are being persecuted the same as Catholics, and in fact would continue to be persecuted the same as Catholics all the way until the early 19th century. And Catholics would continue to be persecuted all the way until the 1850s, mid-19th century. But the same way that they're fighting against Catholics in England, they're also trying to fight against these kinds of ideologies. So Chauncey is kind of a very weird figure, because he's this elite institution, but this elite institution is also where everybody goes to take seminary to become a preacher. So you have this real battle between Old Lights and New Light preachers. And so you also see with the New Light folks that they emphasize this whole idea of fire and brimstone, all that kind of stuff. But also that if somebody like Chauncey is saying, we need more religious freedom, you shouldn't be preaching about fire and brimstone and all that. Now they have turned their guns upon him to say, he's leading you astray. He's, a dirty Arminian, or Arian, there we go. He's one of these, what we would call Unitarians today. And that's been banned. How can we even accept that, especially the president of the leading seminary in the entire New World? Realize Harvard was founded as a seminary. It was a religious institution all the way into the 19th century. Same with Yale, same with King's College, even though later on you'll see a lot of lawyers getting their degrees there. Mostly it's in classics, and then they pass the bar in some other way. This whole idea of a degree in law is kind of a 19th century creation. And the reason why classics are being taught by seminaries rather than by secular institutions is because, monks are the ones who were preserving the classics, and so that tradition maintained itself in academia for centuries. But this is kind of the first pushback against that, right? And furthermore, this whole academic old light kind of thing, it's very elitist. You have to go to college. You have to be accepting of all things, but only because you're the one in power. And instead of trying to spread the word of the gospel, it's more just a given that you're already in the right. So you can see this dynamic playing out, and eventually the old lights win out, and we'll see how that pans out several weeks from now. But, for instance, this is also, because they won out, you'll see the rise of deism. So deism is the idea that God exists but does not exist through working miracles. So, for instance, Thomas Jefferson is a very famous deist, and he actually made his own Bible by cutting out all the passages from a Bible that were miraculous. This actually became quite a controversy at the time. For instance, Thomas Paine was basically shunned from society because of his very open deism. But that comes much later than all this. What makes it possible, though, is the old light preachers winning out. That they're kind of reeling back all this craziness. No more book burnings. Come on, we actually like books. And saying, here is where to draw the line. We're not going to do all this craziness, but we're also going to be religiously tolerant. And that's very important moving forward, especially you'll see it fully implemented by the First Amendment in 1790 when it is ratified. But once again, that's half a century away. So, with all of this, this kind of shows where American politics will go. It leaves a legacy. There's a very clear political divide even today between the religious right and the more secular left. Now realize right and left is a terminology that wouldn't make any sense at this point in time, but we're talking about the legacy, how things come to be. We also see a very gendered form of religion, that women become very much the focal point of this. Notice that in all these pictures, we see women at the forefront. They become the biggest way that they can participate in society is through religion. There's a lot less blocking their way to affecting change in the church. So they take more and more of a part in this, especially since they can wield that whole fire and brimstone to affect change. There's also this evangelism starts going to slavery. Now, this is something I want to discuss, but the main point is there's a fundamental problem when you start having your slaves be the same religion as you. We'll see that throughout slavery's existence up until this point, most of the time, the people being enslaved are a different religion from the slaver. In North Africa, for instance, we'll see slaves, Americans being enslaved by Barbary pirates, specifically because they're Muslim enslaving Christians. Here, they're all kinds of different religions, but they're not Christians when they're making that middle passage. You can see there's going to be some problems coming up because of that. Because, they're solely concerned about people's souls, finding grace. Doesn't matter if they're slaves, they need to become Christians. So you see all these preachers going and preaching amongst slaves. But, it's sowing the seeds of things to come. You can also see in today's populism. Now, can anybody define populism for me real quick? It's actually a famously hard thing to define, but can anybody give me their definition of it? For instance, you could say the current president is a populist.
It's not a majority of people, but like a plurality believe in a certain thing, so they try to act like they're the majority and put it on other people.
That they're saying that they represent the people, right? Doesn't matter whether or not they actually do. But that's one good way of defining it, yeah. And anybody else? There's also the idea that you're trying to inspire the masses into mass movements, right? So it's give and take, right? You're saying that you represent the masses, but then you're also trying to motivate the masses to do something. And you can see that beginning here, specifically with revivalism. You're trying to motivate the masses into, following these preachers with this fire and brimstone and stuff. You see a lot with populism that it becomes quite apocalyptic. You can see it with this president where it's make America great again. That there's been some sort of fall from grace. This is fundamental to American politics. And finally, we also see the creation of this academic distance that we're all participating in right now. That we can talk about society in a very distant manner and not have to deal with, angry protesters sitting right outside the door or anything along those lines. That academia is supposed to be this kind of sacrosanct thing that, you can experiment with more radical ideology before having to apply it to the populace. And you can see that playing today also with how populists treat academia. So you can see all of these kinds of seeds being planted simply by their reaction to the general crisis. With that being said, let me turn this around and let's talk about what those seeds are. That way I can actually catch you all on mic. So the big question is, how is this significant? And I think I've already kind of explained that, but in your own thoughts, for instance, let's talk about slavery. What are those seeds to come? What is the problem with having a slave be the same religion as you? Or, especially if you know the Bible well enough, can you think of things in the Bible that would make that particularly troublesome?
Isn't it within the religion, mostly everybody's usually equal? And then since they were being treated as equals, it kind of conflicts on what you're preaching to them?
Well, we could definitely see in Christianity that there's plenty of beliefs that don't believe in equality. But yes, there is this idea that there's, a fellowship of the brethren, right? That it's always, by becoming Christian, you're more and more part of a larger group. Of course, you can see pretty early on with the creation of the papacy and stuff like that, and bishops and the whole rank structure that flows right into feudalism, that that whole idea of equality doesn't exactly hold. But it is kind of within the pages of the New Testament, at least. There's that whole scene in where Christ is saying, blessed are the meek, blessed are the weak, blessed are the so-and-so. And they're all people who are not well off in society. In fact, at one point he says that it is harder for a camel to slip through the eye of a needle than a rich man to go to heaven. So there's a lot of biblical stuff with this, and when you're trying to say we need to go back to the Bible, there are a lot of seeds. What else could there be in terms of problems with evangelizing slaves?
Could it be similar to the Native Americans becoming the praying Indians and them wanting to be separate?
Right. That there's this explicitly racial sense, right? That, we have this development of white supremacy throughout this period. That people are starting to see themselves as different from slaves. That they're starting to see them not just different as in they are a slave, but now it's in a racial sense that they're inferior. And so there needs to be separation. And then, as you create more separation, you create more secularism, and then that causes a backlash. We will be seeing another Great Awakening in this class later on. So yeah, it is very much the Second Great Awakening will have a lot to do with slavery as well. What else? Have any of you read Exodus? So, what's the big thing of Exodus?
Freeing the people of God from slavery.
Right? So, if you're teaching people who are enslaved about Exodus, kind of gives them an impetus to seek freedom, doesn't it? So, you'll see oftentimes in the coming slave revolts that we'll be talking about, they're often led by preachers. They're often, so for instance, Nat Turner, probably saw that movie a little while back, unfortunately named Birth of a Nation. It's about the Nat Turner revolt, and Nat Turner was a preacher. You've heard of John Brown? He was a Unitarian, just like that Chauncey guy. Although he wasn't really a preacher, he actually failed out of seminary school. John Brown is a funny character because he's just a comedy of errors. But you can see that religion will play a huge part of abolitionism, which will lead us right into the Civil War, kind of the culmination of this class. So, yeah, there's a lot here, right? Let's talk about populism. So, and the religious right. Nowadays, we don't really think of like Trump as like some sort of religious figure, right? He's you'll see a lot of the religious right saying like, I don't like him morally. I find him disgraceful, but he's going to give us some conservative judges or something along those lines, right? They work together despite the fact that they are kind of at odds. And why is that? Why does this show that kind of at odds, that you have populism and religious conservatism somehow working together but also opposed to each other? If you think about it, remember there's no one answer to any of these questions. This is purely to inspire discussion because this is about trying to figure out the significance of history, right? This isn't just some events that happened 3 centuries ago. These are things that affect you today. So, why would populism and religious conservatism be at odds? Remember that Davenport guy? What he was doing? All the book burnings? That's populism, right? You can think of a number of ways that would inspire people who are religiously conservative to not really want to be like that, right? So you can see this built-in opposition to populism even within the religious right. That, populism is kind of conservatism on steroids. It becomes a bit crazy. Now, it actually isn't necessarily conservative. It can be all kinds of different things. We'll see. Well, we won't see in this class, but in the second half of this class, the populism gets really crazy in the late 1890s to the point that it basically creates the impetus to progressivism that leads us right into the 20th century. So all of this is founded right there. So, and let's have one last little bit about why is female piety important here, and how does that, what's the significance of this? Why even bring it up?
Could it be them introducing themselves into like a bigger role in society?
Yeah, precisely. And what do you think that leads to?
It kind of leads to like later on, it leads on to their to like them advocating for their rights and all that, like for the right to vote and basically overall making themselves more important in a society where.
Yeah, and we'll see in the Second Great Awakening portion that women start really advocating their right to vote in, can't remember the date off the top of my head, but at the Seneca Falls Convention in the 1840s. And the Declaration of Sentiments, as it's known, is written almost completely by women who are very active religiously. They're organizers in their churches. They're mostly Quakers and Unitarians. It's a very religiously centered movement all the way until the late 19th and early 20th century when they finally get the vote in 1919. So you have that, but what else? How does that affect the revolution? That's only a week away. How does female piety play a role in the American Revolution? Ever heard of there's always a woman behind any great man? Guess what most of the wives of the founders were? Heavily religious women, right? Very pious women. You can see it in their letters that they'll often talk about, what's the right path? How do we, for instance, John Adams was a Unitarian, and so his wife, Abigail Adams, would constantly be complaining about basically the same kind of thing that Chauncey was complaining about, that, people back here are talking about, all these deists, and how can we have how can we properly declare independence when we are already so far from God? And so, there's this very clear part of women being so pious that they use that to inspire change. And that's not just change within their own lives, but change throughout society as a whole. So, we have about 15 minutes to spare. Any questions? All right, well, have a good day.